This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
Most welcome to our event today. My name is Orla Quinn and I am the Interim Director General of the Institute for International and European Affairs. I'm delighted to welcome you to this symposium on Ireland's digital infrastructure, the resilience of European connectivity, and we are greatly appreciative of the support provided by Vodafone for this event. Just to start, we have both people here in the room. You are most welcome. And we also have our audience online. Again, you are also most welcome. We have a great panel who I will introduce as we move along through the event. Also, please note this event is on the record for your information. So today we're launching a really important report that has been prepared by the Institute of International and European Affairs. The paper, as you will know, is called Secure Connections, Ireland's Digital Infrastructure and the Resilience of European Connectivity. And clearly in today's world where we face many geopolitical challenges, this is of particular importance to us today. The paper is available. You will also be able to read it by scanning the QR code on your lanyard. And this research project took many months to complete, and it saw contributions from senior leaders in industry, government, former politicians and academia, all of whom played a key role in shaping the content and the recommendations of the report. I think this really is where the Institute excels in bringing people together on common problems and those which are of huge importance to us in Ireland. So today we'll discuss how to protect our digital infrastructure. Again, a topic that's particularly to the fore at the moment when we see suspected incidents of sabotage on subsea cables in Europe, drone attacks on data centres in the Middle East, and just how vulnerable we are now to targets in a more dangerous world, it must be said. Building that robust telecommunications ecosystem that is resilient enough to withstand shocks will require all of us to work together, and that includes obviously government, industry, academia and society. We need to find new ways to work together, to share information and to share responsibilities. However, we always, from the Institute, present solutions. We will describe problems, but we never leave it there. So the two researchers that we have that did this research today, Cian FitzGerald, who's the senior researcher at the IIEA, and Barry Colfer, who's our head of research, who worked together collectively to produce this report, have, as I say, outlined the severe challenges for us, but also given us optimism in terms of possible solutions. So conversations like today are really important for us. They help us to identify where we need to go, how we will get there, and how we can work with common purpose on a topic, as I say, that is so important. And as the paper concludes, when we work together, it works. And so that is why I'm so delighted to welcome such a diverse group of you all here today. So to start off today's event and to provide warm welcome from this lovely building, I would like to call on Sabrina Casalta, who's the CEO of Vodafone Ireland, for some words of welcome.
Feargal, Dr. Quinn, and dear colleagues from the government, the academia, the industry, and security expert. Thank you all for joining us today here. Of course, thank you, Feargal, for stepping in with such a short notice. We all wish Minister O'Donovan well and a speedy and full recovery. And thank you, the IIEA partners, for supporting us in this journey. It has been a pleasure working with all of you. And thank you for all of you that contributed to the discussion in the past few months. As we just heard, has been a very constructive, lively, and productive discussion and conversation. You are all very welcome in our still brand new office in the city center. And I think that when last year we decided that we would have moved our office into the city center, one of the reasons to do it was to really be at the heart of this kind of conversation that talk about and shape the digital future for Ireland. And I'm particularly glad today to be here. 2026 marks the 25th anniversary of Vodafone in Ireland, 25 years in which we have contributed more than 20 billion to the Irish economy, and we have built the digital infrastructure for the countries. And when I think back about 25 years ago, I think connectivity was about people and enabling people to talk to each other. Today, connectivity is about people, but it's also about objects, systems, and countries to be connected. 25 years ago, connectivity was a means of communication. Today, connectivity is the backbone of the digital society and the economy we live in. And 25 years ago, the discussion and the investment around connectivity was about coverage, was about availability. Today, as we said, and we hear today, is about resilience, is about security, and is about competitiveness. So as Vodafone, we are really committed to invest and keep bringing the best, secure, and reliable infrastructure, digital infrastructure to the country, because we fully appreciate the role that we have and this infrastructure has as a critical national infrastructure to enable the prosperity and the competitiveness of the country. But resilience and security do not come just from an industry or a company. They really require the full ecosystem of government, academia, security, and different industry to collaborate and work together and coordinate. And I think the discussion and conversation we will follow today comes to a particularly significant moment in time. Ireland is holding the presidency of the European Council at the moment, in a moment where Europe is debating such important topics like the Digital Network Act, the Cybersecurity Act. And Ireland, it says, has to go through some key decision, for example, around the spectrum policy in the near future. All these topics together will really define what is going to be the framework, the context, and the terms for which we can build and we can invest in digital infrastructure. And I strongly believe that Ireland has not only the opportunity to strongly contribute, as always done, to the discussion, but really to lead the way, potentially and ideally by example, in taking the decision that we really shape the competitiveness of the countries and the continent in the near future. And that's the reason why we decided to partner with the IIEA to talk about resilience. And our objective since the very beginning was not just to assess the role of the resilience and security, was not to define or discuss if it's important, but to talk about how and what resilience would look like, not only for the industry and the infrastructure, but for the economy and the society in the country in the near future. And as the CEO of one of the leading infrastructure players in the country, I'm really glad to hear that the conversation almost immediately moved away from talking and defining the problem, where there is broad consensus, into discussing solution, into finding way all together, bringing all the key stakeholders at the same table to share idea, to discuss about responsibility, to cover all the aspects that can really influence how we build the digital backbone of the society and the economy in the near future. So I think that today is going to be a very interesting discussion. I really hope you will read the report that is very pragmatical, is very strong and very specific with actionable actionable proposal for the future, because what we need now is to move from discussing the problem into taking decision and to act. And that's exactly what we need, because all the decisions that we take today will really shape the competitiveness of this society and this economy for the next 10 years and potentially over. So thank you to IIEA for partnering with us. Thank you all for joining us today and contributing in a factual way to what is going to be a very constructive conversation that I'm really confident will move us ahead to build the digital future for Ireland and potentially for Europe. Thank you.
Many thanks, Sabrina, for that lovely warm welcome and for your support for this work that we have all been involved in. I'd now like to call on Feargal Ó Coigligh to join us. Feargal is the Secretary General of the Department of Culture, Communications and Sport, a post he was appointed to in 2024. Again, we extend our warm wishes to Minister O'Donovan and wish him a speedy recovery. The department has a broad range of functions. No doubt, Feargal, you are busy right across the arts, culture, the cultural institutions, media, telecommunications and sport, and obviously the telecommunications is to the forefront of our discussion today. Feargal has worked across a range of the civil service in a range of challenging positions, both in terms of our environmental and infrastructure. Most recently, before his current appointment, he was in the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage, working on water and housing policy. Feargal will talk to us for about 15 minutes, and then he and I will have a discussion. And that essentially then will start the beginning of the event for us. Feargal, you are most welcome.
Orla, thanks very much, and thanks very much for the good wishes for Minister O'Donovan. As many people know, he's taken ill in Brussels a fortnight ago. He's making a good recovery. He's actually at home working, but he's not allowed to come to Dublin, so I've had to fill in for a couple of events. And in the best traditions of a minister, I'll be here for today and for discussion, and then I'll disappear to another ministerial function that I'm filling in for. But I have my colleagues Tim and Breffney here who will be joining you for the full day. So none of the messages that come out of today's meeting will be lost. So I'd like to thank Orla and the IIEA for the invitation to speak here today and for organising the event, and actually for organising the paper. To Sabrina and Vodafone, thank you very much as well for partnering with the IIEA in preparing the paper. You mentioned the 25 years anniversary of Vodafone, the investment of Vodafone in Ireland, and the journey that communications has taken. And I just have to pay a tribute to you for the TV advertisement campaign, which is a fantastic illustration of that journey, certainly in terms of the customer. Cian and Barry, thank you very much for preparing the paper. It's actually very, very clear. Recommendations very, very clear, very well laid out. The increased national and European focus on resilience and security reflects the growing frequency and severity of real-world disruption, many of which have been experienced directly in Ireland. War and the increase of protectionist trends has changed the conversation radically. Meanwhile, climate change, long talked about, is making itself felt. Storms like Éowyn in 25, Dara in 24, Babette in 23 have exposed our vulnerabilities. Damage to communications and power infrastructure has given rise to real impacts on people and communities. So resilience is no longer a theoretical concern, but a practical reality. The department recognises the key challenges set out in the IIEA paper around balancing investment in resilience with continued investment in innovation. We are all growing with the growing complexity of regulation, trying to catch up with the acceleration of change in the technological environment, the cost of regulation, and the balancing of investment, consumer protection, while supporting security, resilience, and innovation. Strengthening networks against physical, cyber, and climate-related risks requires significant long-term investment in redundancy, protection, and maintenance, which may not deliver immediate commercial returns. It may also require investments in completely alternative systems such as satellite connectivity. At the same time, investments in innovation in areas such as 5G, fibre, and emerging technologies is essential to support economic growth and competitiveness. Successfully marrying these priorities requires clear policy direction, stable regulation, and close collaboration between government and industry to ensure that resilience is embedded into digital infrastructure from the outset, rather than being treated as a separate or competing objective. The EU Preparedness Union Strategy sets out a framework to strengthen the EU's ability to anticipate, prevent, and respond to major crises, including cyber events, cyber incidents, and geopolitical shocks. It promotes an all-hazards, whole-of-government and whole-of-society approach with a strong emphasis on protecting critical infrastructure, improving coordination, and strengthening public-private cooperation to ensure essential services can withstand and recover from disruption. In Ireland, the establishment of the Telecommunications Response and Resilience Group in September 2025, an ask of Minister O'Donovan, is making a positive contribution to public-private cooperation. This group acts as a conduit for industry, government, and ComReg to consult and exchange views on issues related to telecoms response and resilience. This includes, where appropriate, relevant standards, policies, and procedures. It provides a framework for cooperation between all members in emergency situations. It also has the potential to serve as a mechanism to develop emergency exercises between industry and government, and that was one of the issues that the task force, the report touches on. Investment in digital infrastructure is crucial to improving resilience. Through state funding, as of last week, 15th of July, over 500,000 premises are now passed by the National Broadband Ireland Plan across 26 counties and available for immediate connection. Over 182 premises are already connected. That investment has involved an extensive programme of pole testing and replacement to ensure that the network is resilient to the threat of extreme wind. And the state's investment, it complements, of course, as Sabrina pointed out, the major investment by the commercial sector, Open Air, Cyro, and Virgin Media. Additionally, the transition from copper to fibre-based fixed line networks over the coming years is a resilience building exercise. Fibre is more resilient to the effects of weather, it's lighter, non-conductive, less affected by rain and temperature changes, and requires fewer immediate exchanges between the core network and the customer. In terms of future government initiatives, in June, the government approved the procurement of a cell broadcast public warning system. This system will allow for emergency alerts to be sent directly to mobile phones in affected areas during major incidents, ensuring the public can receive timely, reliable information when it is most needed. The public warning system will help to improve societal preparedness and resilience. And finally, government has announced funding for satellite-based quantum communication infrastructure as part of the Euro QCI programme, which aims to bring quantum-level security to Europe's proposed IRIS² satellite project. Subsea resilience is a key element in the report. Since 2024, Ireland has supported the work of the European Commission's Submarine Cable Infrastructure Expert Group. Since its formation, the group has produced the EU's first mapping of existing and planned submarine cable infrastructure, a coordinated EU-wide risk assessment identifying key threats and vulnerabilities, and guidance on stress testing these systems. In May, the department established the Subsea Communication Cables Industry Forum. This includes the cable owners, developers, suppliers, and repair industry. We have a common interest in ensuring a deep working relationship between the sector and to ensure its views are inputted into the major and strategic emergency management frameworks. On the government side, we're not just convening stakeholders, we are taking action. For example, on subsea infrastructure, we seek to improve the resilience and security and choice through additional routes to Ireland. The Irish-led Pisces project was recently awarded €19 million under the European Connectivity Facility to connect Galway to France and on to Spain and Portugal, connecting into routes to Africa and South America. We also will pursue additional connectivity to Europe via northern route, and ensuring that that facility is well funded under the next multi-annual financial framework is one of our priorities. Finally, in line with our commitments under the UK-Ireland 2030 joint statement, the Department is also strengthening coordination with the United Kingdom to improve our preparedness for incidents affecting telecoms infrastructure of mutual interest, and we will be conducting a joint exercise of our arrangements later this year. We are, of course, seeing significant change in the regulatory landscape. The Critical Entities Resilience Directive came into force at EU level in 2023, and its full implementation is now in train, led by the Department of Defence. ComReg has been designated as the National Competent Authority for Digital Infrastructure under the SARE. The complementary NIS2 directive will be given effect in Ireland through the National Cybersecurity Bill being progressed by the Department of Justice. And again, ComReg will be designated as the NCA for digital infrastructure sector under NIS2. The implementation of these frameworks represents a step change in the way the state focuses on ensuring that the digital infrastructure sector systematically identifies and manages risk, undertakes stress testing, and invests in continuous improvements to withstand all hazards, man-made and natural. The Department is aware that these changes place significant capacity building demands on both ComReg and the sector, and we will support ComReg and the industry in meeting these enhanced requirements, recognising the scale and complexity of the transition involved. The successful rollout of these measures will require strong cooperation, coordination, and consistency across state entities to ensure clarity of roles, to avoid duplication of effort, and to deliver a coherent and effective resilience and security regime for the sector. On national security, the Department is also supporting the Department of Defence's first National Maritime Security Strategy, published in February, which places a particular emphasis on critical undersea infrastructure. Earlier this month, the Department of Justice published its draft National Cyber Security Strategy, which is now open for consultation. This strategy emphasises the commitment in the programme for government to put National Security Authority on a statutory footing, ensuring that it has the legal authority and resources to provide the full spectrum of security clearances required to meet the current and future needs of government departments, public sector bodies, and commercial entities. Again, the issue of security clearances, an issue identified in the report. The strategy includes measures to build institutional capacities to strengthen the ecosystem. And just a word in relation to Ireland's EU presidency. Our team in Dublin and in Brussels are working full tilt right now in terms of delivering the EU's agenda, not just Ireland's agenda, helping to chairing meetings to deliver on major packages such as the Digital Networks Act and the Mobile Satellite Services Decision. And these decisions, these legislative proposals will have fundamental impacts on our sectors in the coming years. So, just to conclude, we are collectively putting the building blocks in place that will ensure that the sector, both public and private entities, improves its capabilities to be resilient. That involves continued investment in infrastructure that is designed with hazards in mind. It also involves investment in organisational capacities to be better prepared for crisis. As committed to under Digital Ireland, the Department is now working on updating the sectoral strategy for digital connectivity and infrastructure. In addition to the focus on networks and connectivity, it will also address issues around resilience and preparing for emergencies. So today's Secure Connections paper from the IIEA will be a very useful input to that strategy, which will be issued for public consultation in the coming months. So again, to thank IIEA, to thank Barry and Cian, to thank Vodafone today for all your works in preparing that paper, which will be, I say, very, very useful for us as we carry our work forward. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Feargal. I think your speech actually just highlights what a complex world we're living in and how many pieces there are of this. It's funny, when I was Secretary General for the Department of Enterprise, I remember somebody asking at one stage, who speaks for digital in Ireland? And I think you now are speaking for communications, but it's a complex weave. How do you ensure that there is and I don't mean a single voice, but a coherent approach to the complexity of the world you're managing?
Yeah, and look, Orla, this is, I think, because the situation is evolving, the question is evolving, and the answer is evolving. And I'm not sure we have a perfect answer to that right now. If you look at some of the directives we've mentioned, how functions are being distributed across regulators, how functions are distributed across departments, we all have a part to play. I heard a Taoiseach recently talking about the need for more ministries to bring together a Department of the Marine. You might remember that old canard, which was done before, and then it was realized actually Marine touches so many areas that you can't bring everything together.
Yeah.
Digital is ubiquitous. So all departments are now grappling with digital. The Department of Taoiseach does take a strong lead in terms of coordinating, but we all have a role. It's very, very interesting yesterday. And Andy Burnham's new government, DCIT, the Department for Digital and Technology, was taken apart, where a lot of the conversation, even among ourselves, is, well, actually, do we need a Department for Digital? And which the UK put in place, I don't know, 7 or 8, a few years ago, now taken apart on the basis that actually digital needs to be close to the sectors that it supports.
Right.
You can argue these things many ways. So, like, I was down in Kilkenny at a close-off event marking the completion of the National Broadband Plan rollout, the first event, and the people on the stage were people from the creative sectors working in rural Ireland, depending on the connectivity. So I thought for me as Secretary of the Department of Culture, that was great to see. But anyway, it just shows the complexity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, clearly it is so important for Ireland in terms of maintaining our position at EU level, globally. I suppose we carry such a weight now in Europe.
We do.
Both in terms of the companies that are invested here in Ireland, and the cables and etc. So I'm just wondering, in terms of, and you mentioned obviously the EU presidency being really important, just how do we continue to maintain and create those conditions for competitiveness, for innovation?
Well, I think we have to always show we're serious, that we take our responsibilities seriously. There is one thing, setting up a taxation arrangements which makes it attractive for companies to HQ in Ireland. They're the backbone of so much of economic success. But the corollary of that is we have a responsibility as a government to ensure that all sectors are properly regulated, that they play their part. The sectors themselves want proper regulation. We, again, no more than your question on digital, Orla, these responses are cross-government. Is the taxation system right? Is the regulation fit for purpose? Is our education system providing the right graduates with the right skills that we require? And then, if you look at it, maybe in this conversation, one of our weak spots has traditionally been the department, the government's or the nation's view of defence, of international security, on the basis that, well, we're only a small player, we're a neutral country, we're out there, nobody's interested in us. And actually, no, lots of people are interested in us. And I think government recognises that. You can see transformation happening in the world of defence. The fact that we have a new national maritime security strategy for the first time, it's changing. And it's funny, when these things change, you kind of ask yourself, well, this was so obvious, why didn't we do it before? And you feel we're catching up. But look, we are catching up, and we are putting in the investment. So anyway, it's the totality of the package, and securing our cables, carrying so much data from North America to Europe is a key part of that.
I was struck recently, we had another seminar in the IIEA, and we had the EU representative for the Horn of Africa, and she spoke about 90% of cables coming from Asia into Europe come via the Red Sea. And again, most recently, we've just seen the extension of conflict into the Red Sea, including as well as the Straits of Hormuz. I suppose what keeps you awake at night, Feargal? What do you sort of really worry about Ireland and the risks for the telecommunication sector?
I think it is that. I mean, Cian was on the radio this morning talking about rogue Russian ships traveling the seas, and that is a huge worry. We were at a conference in Croke Park. On the telecoms, Garrett, the year before last, or last year probably. And this was a natural disaster. It was about the earthquake in Japan, and said that was it 7 of the 8 cables connecting Japan were cut during that earthquake. I know that's a natural disaster, but that's the first time it hit me how vulnerable these systems can be. And this time it's a global security threat. That issue of being peripheral and people don't bother about us that we might have had in our heads is turned upside down. Our old colleagues, or the full team of Secretaries General, went to Brussels in January as a pre-presidency trip to meet our counterparts, to meet all the institutions. And what struck me from all my work in Brussels over my career is that every single topic, every single conversation, every single area was prefaced or was seen through the framework or the lens of security. That had never happened before. And suddenly Ireland, as a kind of peripheral country, was now seen as a weak point on the western side of the EU, right? So we now have to respond to that, and we are beginning to respond to that. But it is a huge worry.
It's huge, yeah. Somebody asked me once, what do you call a group of Secretaries General? What's the collective term? And the answer was a worry. So I think across the group, it's so much. Just turning, and again, to another aspect of the report, it talks about regulation. And certainly we've had many discussions in the institution on regulation and simplification rather than deregulation. And I just, again, you highlighted some of the areas of regulation coming from the EU. I'm just wondering, how can we collectively share responsibility with the regulatory system that we have?
Yeah, this is really, really tricky, because if you look at the march of technology, like as a department, we have responsibility for social media as well as communication system. AI, false generation of images, the Grok issue. We're responding. Society, I'm not saying government, society is responding with new regulations all the time. And the complexity is astounding. And I find it difficult to understand, even within the regulators within my department of ComReg, Garrett here, and Commissioner Man, who's doing what, and so it is very, very difficult. Even the simplification agenda, I heard somebody refer to it as the complication agenda.
The what? Say it again?
Complication agenda.
Oh dear.
No, that's a little bit trite. I mean, there is goodwill to simplify as far as possible, but sometimes at the EU level you see layers on top to speed up processes without fundamentally changing the laws underneath, and that's very much intention. When I was speaking to Garrett before we come up here this morning, and he's on where are we on in terms of our resources for our new functions. This is an issue for government. You can see in the Department of Public Expenditure pushing back the sector, who's asked to pay for the cost of regulation. is probably also pushing back, having those conversations as well. So this is a difficult space. What I would say is, if people see opportunities where there's legacy regulation, which is no longer required, are there things that we can strip back, because we have to respond to the new challenges.
Yeah.
But maybe we can drop some of the regulations and the old challenges.
Yeah.
We've seen, like, in the postal services, for example, which comes under ComReg, the old model has gone, but the regulatory framework is still there. Garrett might say that's probably marginal in terms of business, but are there other examples where some of the older world can be set aside? But the reality is the world's getting more and more complex.
Yeah. I suppose one of the advantages for Ireland is that we are small and we tend to know each other, and people engage more.
Yeah.
So you have that input, and indeed our report is a classic example of everybody's voice coming through.
Yeah.
And so I absolutely welcome the fact, Feargal, that you will find this useful and helpful. So is there anything that collectively we can do to help you in your role?
Well, let's just maintain the dialogue. I mean, I mentioned some of the structures there that exist already for dialogue between the department and industry. If there's ways of improving that or different structure to enhance that, absolutely. Look, everything we do, we'll follow a period of public consultation. But if there are any other ways of enhancing the structures, the dialogue, absolutely.
Okay, great. Well, that's obviously an invitation to us in the Institute and to others in the room. Just maybe, and I know you're under time pressure, and the presidency consumes so much of the public sector capacity during these few months. Just, you mentioned the National Broadband Plan as being a particular success. Are there lessons that you've drawn or we can draw from that?
People need to be careful what lessons they draw for that, because I see, I mean, a lot of issues, a lot of the report talked about the cost, who's going to bear the cost. And obviously the state stepped in where the commercial sector said it wasn't viable to serve our citizens. That's, we're not here to be a soft touch, because it's the taxpayer that pays. But we are here for a dialogue, where there are gaps. So I mentioned, like, the subsea infrastructure is a fantastic example, because that's been put in place completely by the commercial sector, by big players. But now we're looking through using European funding at how to enhance that. So look, there is a role for the state, but the state's not a soft touch either.
Okay. Last question before we let you go, Feargal. And you have talked about state capacity, expertise. There is always, I suppose, that push to have more expertise, more officials, more regulators, or less regulators indeed. Just that complexity. Do you think we're well shaped to manage that complexity?
I think that issue of the pace of change, ComReg, you're completely different than you were 5 years ago. Commission the Man used to be the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland with 60 staff. Now it has a whole lot of functions with 300 plus staff. Both regulators under the aegis of the department are looking to expand significantly, right?
Okay.
I think we need to stop every so often, every couple of years, need to stop and think, well, how are these structures working together? I mean, the data commissioner, all the regulators, how are the functions distributed? I think that's something we have to absolutely keep in mind all the time.
Yeah.
I was astounded. I was looking at the paper yesterday, Orla. I always had in my head for most of my career, the civil service was around 30,000 workers for most of the employees for most of their career, and went up and down a little bit in terms of recession. Yesterday we were 58,000 in the last from 2016, last 10 years.
10 years, yeah.
And they're all roles put in place to fulfill functions
Mm.
that government has asked us to do. But it just shows
Yeah.
the growth, you know, and the regulators are the same.
Yeah, and the growth of the population.
And the growth of the
It's
population.
been
Yeah.
really enormous as
Yeah.
well. Feargal, thank you very much. Thank you for your time, for your interest, for your commitment. Can we wish you every success for the next few months, and in particular success on this agenda. And the Institute is always there to help you where we can.
Really appreciate that,
Thank
Orla.
you.
Thanks so much.
Now we move from that, which sets us up very nicely, I think, to the next part of our event, which is the actual presentation by one of the researchers, Cian FitzGerald, of the paper. Cian and Barry have been working on this for many, many months, and I think it's a really good opportunity for Cian to now give us an overview of the paper as presented. He's just fiddling with his mic, so we're just ready to go. I'm sorry. Oh, I'll sit down. Yeah, that's all right. I don't want to block anybody's view.
Make sure that the PowerPoint presentation was working, which it seems to be doing. But if anything isn't working, please do let me know. I guess the first place to begin here is actually with words of thanks, not only just the people who directly contributed to this paper as a part of the research roundtables, which we hosted 2 of them, but also I can see a lot of faces in here who, you know, privately on the sides or at different conferences I met, I was able to ask questions of, both in government, academia, and industry, who provided a lot of guidance. And so this is really where I think the IIEA's research is at its best, when it has every single bit of society's voice in our research. And that's what's produced this paper here. So in terms of the key takeaways, just to save you having to read the paper, though I really would hope that you would read it, that the first is that telecommunications infrastructure is essential to daily life. That this is our first principles beginning, that it underpins banking, healthcare. Everything you do is often mediated by the infrastructure that telecommunications operators provide. Secondly, the telecommunications infrastructure is now a target in a more turbulent world. We've seen this with threats around subsea cables that we've spoken about quite a bit, but also what we've seen in the Middle East with data centers being directly targeted. And I'll discuss this a little bit later. Third, that competitiveness and security are now intrinsically linked. That this is not, especially when it comes to telecommunications, this is not just a telecommunications story. This is also a societal and economic story. That this is the infrastructure that underpins our ability to communicate, your ability to go to work, your ability for, again, banking, tech, all of the pharma, all of the critical services in our society. So this is not just a telco story. This is an Ireland economic story. It's no longer just about security. It's no longer just about making sure that we can protect the infrastructure, but it's about resilience is now also going to be more important. So being able to navigate the shocks after they happen, that's going to become increasingly essential. And it's the foundational pivot point of our report. Fifth, that regulatory complexity risk undermining the investment in this resilience, in this additional redundancy and resilience. Oh, sorry, that hasn't come up. There we go. And then finally, the government and industry are going to need to work in tandem to navigate these challenges together. So Ireland's defence limitations are no longer just necessarily an Ireland problem, that this infrastructure is not just, this isn't just Irish infrastructure, this is European infrastructure. And so you can see that 75% of all transatlantic cables run through or near Ireland, and that in 2019, 30% of all EU data was held in data centers in Ireland. That number has grown since then. And the problem is Ireland is not immune from these trends. There's a growing number of suspected sabotage incidents in Europe, or cable damage, such as the Baltic Connector cable damage in 2023 between Finland and Estonia, and the Svalbard cable damage in 2022. I was reading a report as a part of as a part of the research for this, that's between 2023 and 2024, Russia increased its sabotage operations on European critical infrastructure, so not just telco but also energy, by over 246%. So there's a substantial growth. And as mentioned earlier, Ireland's not immune from these trends. That we already see Russian vessels. I was glad to hear that people were listening to me on the radio this morning. That that the Russian vessel, such as the Yantar, a Russian scientific vessel that can be used to map cables, has been spotted in and around Ireland repeatedly. One of the difficulties that, and this emerged during the roundtables discussions, that Ireland's present military investments are focusing on sensing. So this is radar and sonar acquisitions. And while this is very good for detecting and also for attribution of actors of who might have carried out a bit of cable damage, it's unclear as to whether Russia or maybe any other geopolitical actor are meaningfully deterred by attribution. Russia has not been deterred in the past from carrying out other incidents throughout Europe by being suspect number one and that being made public. And finally, as a risk, there's a potential for these sabotage risks and Ireland's known limitations in being able to defend this infrastructure for the viability of future projects. So this may weaken investment in future projects if there's a risk that Ireland will not be able to protect that infrastructure. And that just affects, and this sounds pretty dull, but it affects the risk registers of these projects, but also the insurability of these projects. So our roundtable identified several strategic level risks. The first and foremost was the growing risk of kinetic attack on telecommunications infrastructure. So we've seen just this year in the 2026 war in the Arabian Gulf, Iranian drones hitting data centers in the UAE and Bahrain. That knocked out people's ability in the region to access banking, certain services. I think Deliveroo might have been affected, or a couple of the food ordering sites. But this is very real consequences. This is very real consequences, and that was a relatively limited conflict. And in 2024, we saw during the French Olympic Games, we saw long distance land-based cables being cut. And what's important throughout these roundtables was that the threat actors was considered to be very, very, very diverse. So when we spoke with industry, there was concerns of lone wolf attackers maybe targeting 5G infrastructure on land. But there's also the risk of intelligence services, such as the Russian Federation targeting subsea cables, but also what happens during armed conflict. And we're seeing that in the full range of possible threat actors, telecommunications consistently is being targeted. Third, what was identified expressed by the roundtables were supply chain risks. In particular, a number of representatives expressed concern over the growing dominance of US hyperscalers in the market in the provision of cloud computing services and cables. And separately, also representatives expressed concern over Chinese 5G products. What was interesting was that this particular point was contested amongst multiple participants, with other participants saying that Europeans deserved access to the best technology at the best price. So this is going to be a really interesting piece of this puzzle around questions of security, digital sovereignty, and economic competitiveness. And finally, and most interesting, this did not feature as much as I would love to have spent more time teasing this out, was that the AI boom was actually viewed as a physical risk to resilience, that it has absorbed much of the spare capacity in terms of extra fiber optics, memory and chips, and that should an incident occur, it's making projects more expensive and could also slow down repair times should an incident occur. So throughout the discussions, and it's been mentioned several times today, this question of the costs have to fall somewhere. And so a key part of this discussion was around resilience, regulation, and planning. And multiple representatives expressed a concern that a sense that maybe industry is being asked to do too much at the same time: decarbonization, industry-led growth, resilience, security. And this was causing uncertainty, which was seen to be reducing investment. And there's a number of EU regulations. We've spoken quite a bit about the updated Cybersecurity Act, CSA2, which has significant financial costs for industry. The estimated number by the European Commission's own estimates are between 3.4 billion to 4.3 billion per year for 3 years. And I can see there was a colleague in IBEC earlier also identified that the number just for Ireland could be 730 million euro in Ireland alone. Separately, around permitting, representatives expressed concern around that permitting was causing projects either to be delayed, cancelled, or relocated, and that some more critical representatives from industry did state that the time frame for new projects was seen as a black hole, and that this was causing new infrastructure not to be built. and in particular of most interest because it features in our recommendation letter later, that there were significant concerns over the judicial review process, that representatives are concerned that they could get quite far into the approval process and then find themselves in the High Court quite late. And so ultimately what the current regulatory regime and permitting environment does, or at least according to our roundtables and the evidence and the data that we had access to, is that it was reducing redundancy, which in turn reduced resilience. But there was acknowledgement across the board from government to industry to academia that this will need to change. So the question is, how can we increase resilience? And this is maybe, if I've described, as Orla said, if I've described the problems to you, though I love, as a defense analyst, I often do enjoy just describing problems. What are the solutions? So we try to identify several actionable solutions, primarily focused on policymakers. So the first is that Ireland should develop a clear framework for balancing these responsibilities and allocations. As I mentioned earlier, there's significant financial costs, significant regulatory complexity, and we need to think about how do we allocate those responsibilities in a way that is equitable, in a way that has the best possible outcome for resilience and for our societies. In particular, what was quite interesting around the where did the cost fall question is that representatives from industry expressed that telecommunications is different to other essential services such as electricity, which are state-owned enterprises, and that government has a greater capacity to provide support to the energy sector rather than to telecommunications, which is held in private hands. So a possible answer to the where should the cost fall question that we identified was whether or not there could be a tax credit similar to the research and development tax, corporation tax credit. There it is. Whether or not that could be used to help to support industry as it makes investments in resilience. Number two, from the roundtable is that Ireland should seek to provide greater long-term certainty on spectrum policy. As mentioned, the Digital Networks Act is coming down the line. This explicitly says that regulators should encourage longer term contracts, and so this could provide greater certainty, which could mean more investment in redundancy and resilience. Three, I just have to make sure it appears. We should expedite the creation of a security clearance system. This was repeated throughout the roundtables. What's important is that government and the private sector have access to different but equally essential information. Importantly, the private sector has access. They know their business. They know the risks that they face. They know the risks that their organization faces. At the same time, government has access to more secret or classified information related to perhaps adversarial intent, as well as also to a deeper network of other states. At present, Ireland has a limited capacity to share this sensitive information around geopolitical risks in a structured way, and we see security clearances as a key strategic enabler for this. Fourth, and we can discuss this later, there's a need for more crisis simulations, and I was quite pleased when Secretary General Ó Coigligh mentioned that they are going to be doing more exercises, but there is certainly a need for this, and I can make practical, and also I can make several practical reasons for this. The first is for the exchange of information and to bridge the gap between government and industry. In particular, we see that throughout the roundtables, but also throughout just several conferences I've been, there's this sort of gap between government and industry are seeing the same problems, but they have very different approaches as to how to resolve these issues. Trying to work together through exercises could play a key role in bridging those gaps. Secondly, it would allow us to identify unforeseen risks and to test our responses to these unforeseen risks in what is often called a safe to fail environment, that you're able to identify where your systems might have gaps, where those systems might break down, And finally, and this is often maybe the softer part of the recommendation, but I really can't stress how important it is that it does develop peer-to-peer relationships amongst key decision makers. This is particularly important for crisis response, that it's simply about knowing who to pick up the phone to, and the first time you're talking to them is not, there's a big problem, that you're familiar with one another. And finally, as mentioned here, it's about developing that shared risk perception and common purpose in response. We only have 7 recommendations, so I'll go through this quickly. Fifth, there's a need to increase institutional capacity and capability, as mentioned by Secretary General Ó Coigligh, that regulatory complexity has outpaced the ability of the state to manage it. It's becoming increasingly complex. That's a quote that came from one of our roundtables, and that there's a need for more civil servants. And what was really, really interesting is that the establishment of the Maritime Area Regulatory Authority, which gave the state more capability for speeding up approval for permits and approvals, this was seen as a very positive case by industry, as a very positive case study. So there's certainly an appetite for more capability, more people who can be over an increasingly complex policy environment. 6, national security should be directly reflected in judicial review reform. In particular, this will provide greater certainty for projects that would enhance resilience. We'd include this in the reform process that's currently ongoing. We'd be including this in the public interest test. And it also stresses the importance of sort of building in national security for overall national government planning. And finally, space is essential for resilience. So this came up repeatedly throughout our roundtables. The space-based systems are essential for delivery of services, but often do not feature prominently enough. So systems such as GPS, but also increasingly the role of position, navigation, and timing systems are not just essential for your sat nav or for using Google Maps. It's also essential for the operation of our financial system. And what's also important is that EU programs such as IRIS², they do represent an opportunity for Ireland. Ireland is geographically quite well positioned to participate in these programs, and we also have a burgeoning space industry that will be able to support some of these projects and access some of this funding. What's quite interesting, just as a slight aside, the security clearance problem is also directly related to this, is that many of the organizations that might participate in these projects cannot access that funding due to a lack of security clearance system. And finally, we believe that a new office for space could play a critical role in coordinating efforts across government, not just in being able to access the economic opportunities, but also playing a greater role in coordination across national resilience. So thank you. That's our paper. I really do hope you read it, and thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Cian. We're very lucky in the Institute to have Cian as a senior researcher, and as he has clearly demonstrated, he is a leading Irish expert on national security and the role of the private sector in defence. And indeed, he has covered areas such as the EU Common Security and Defence Policy and many matters pertaining to Ireland's national security. So thank you for that overview. I think it sets us up very nicely for our panel discussion with the experts that are joining us. And again, we're delighted to have them, and we're delighted to welcome our 3 experts today, and I will briefly introduce them, if I may. So we will be joined by Rebecca Nottingham, and Rebecca is an expert on critical infrastructure resilience, international defence and security, and government policy and strategy. And Rebecca, I know you have extensive experience leading policy development for the UK government. And indeed, you culminated as head of policy for Subsea fibre optic communications and previous roles on critical subsea infrastructure. And most recently, you have set up and become director of Bright Subsea Consulting, and again, advisory projects, including work with the Crown Estate on subsea communications. And again, looking at the long term, which we talked about earlier, out to 2050, and working with the National Oceanography Centre and many other partners in terms of resilience for small island states. So again, very directly related to our discussion this morning. You are most welcome, Rebecca. And if you'd like to join us, and indeed, Garrett, join us, and Ben, and I can introduce you as we go along. I'm going to take the last seat over there, so if that helps. So we're also joined by Garrett Blaney, who's the chairperson of the Commission for Communications Regulation, ComReg, more commonly known. Again, Garrett has been chairperson. His second chairperson commenced in January 25. Previously a member of the Commission for the Regulation of Utilities. So strong, very strong regulatory experience. Currently the chair of the Agency for the Cooperation of Energy Regulators, the ACER board, and also indeed president of the Council of the European Energy Regulations as well in 2017. 20 years experience working in the industry. So again, huge experience both across industry, working for Viridian Power and Energy, Huntstown Power, and also now, as I say, very lucky to have him as chairperson of ComReg. And then finally, we're joined by Ben Wreschner, I beg your pardon, Ben. He's the Government Relations Director at Vodafone Group, and he's obviously steeped in regulation policy director. He is leading on all external aspects of Vodafone's M&A and market entry related activity, including the satellite proposition in conjunction with AST Space Mobile. Ben has worked in the digital sector for over 25 years as a consultant before joining Vodafone. And indeed, as we were talking earlier, he spends a lot of his time in the Brussels environment, working with, representing Vodafone and working with EU institutions. So we're really pleased to have you all, and you are most welcome. So what we propose then is that each of our panels will address you for maybe 4, 5, 6 minutes, and then we will open for questions. And as I mentioned earlier, this session is on the record. Those of you online, please put your questions online, and we have we will take both questions from the floor and questions from our online audience. Thank you. So now I shall sit down and I will call on Rebecca first, if you would like to make some opening comments, Rebecca.
Of course. Firstly, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's really lovely to be here, particularly to help support the launch of this fantastic paper. So congratulations, Cian and Barry, for your outstanding work. And for a fascinating sort of set of questions and topics that we can lean into on this discussion. So in our discussions and pre-meets ahead of this panel, we were talking about the sort of changes that we have seen over time and the nature of the threats. And I was thinking about how I would answer those from different perspectives if I lean into government or academia or industry. And I realize they're all slightly different answers, but I think it very much touches on the holistic nature of these issues and these considerations. So if you'll indulge me, I will touch slightly on each of those different lenses, because I think it gives that perspective. So from an academic perspective, I really resonated with the discussion in this paper of the change in the sort of the international order, the way that cables 5-10 years ago, if I was writing a paper on whether cables would ever be considered a military target, I would have put it in the highly improbable, possible but improbable sector. That dynamic is very clearly changing. We're seeing open discussions of things like data centers being considered a target for military attack. Now, whether or not that's still considered legitimate in the international order is a very complicated legal question, but the fact is that state behavior is changing and behavior around it is changing. So from a sort of an academic perspective, the dynamics of the structures around telecommunications, how we perceive it as sort of a military target, but also how we interact with it as part of our everyday life is a really interesting and complicated topic. And I think we will continue to see some quite rapid change in that space. From a government perspective, certainly cables have really increased in awareness. I think we can all very much agree that telecommunications risks, and particularly the risk dynamics around subsea infrastructure, have dramatically come to the fore. I've seen the change since my time in what was DCMS, which became DCIT while I was in tenure, and is now sadly no longer DCIT. But over that time, I have seen a dramatic change from being the person who was going cap in hand to different government departments going, subsea cables really have an impact on you as defence leads, as leads in sort of energy sector. How can we work together? To now the conversation is very dynamic and it's very security focused. So I think that comes with opportunities for governments and industry alike, and I'll touch on that again. But I think it comes with risk as well. We heard the Secretary General say that from a European perspective, things are seen from a very security-focused lens, and that can give a lot of attention. It can give a lot of oxygen to risks. It can help get measures through much more rapidly than we might have otherwise seen. It certainly attracts more sort of economic power and resource weight behind things, which is always an asset. But it also gives us complexity in that problems are then primarily seen through a security lens, and that isn't necessarily the best way to resolve. For example, I think resilience is one of the critical factors that is a strong theme of this particular paper, but also a lot of the conversations of how do we communicate better, how do we work collaboratively, and how do we collectively build resilience in all of the everyday measures so that when crisis happens, we can carry on dealing with it with the structures already in place. And I worry that when security is the primary topic of conversation, it lifts the discussion very, very high so that you are focused on the military threat, you are focused on high-end crisis, you are focused on a very significant event, whereas actually we see a whole range of threats, hazards, sabotage, potential sort of low-level events that could have varying impacts. So I'll wrap up then with a sort of an industry perspective, because I think that gives a really nice rounding off, and that for the industry, in some respects, this is business as usual. Obviously, there are changes over time. There's significant developments in innovation. There's changes in technology. Then there's changes in good practices. I think a really nice example is the statistics from the International Cable Protection Committee. Every year they produce an overview of the faults that have happened on subsea cables worldwide, and as far as can be determined, the cause. And that has held fairly stable. So the 2025 figures are 86% of all faults to subsea infrastructure, to subsea cables, were caused by either fishing or anchorage. And that statistic has held pretty even, give or take a few percentage, for the decade since they've been running this particular analysis. What has changed is that the distance of cables, the distance of cables covered in the repairs has increased significantly. So we have much more infrastructure that's being protected, and the number of faults has stayed roughly level. So in real terms, there's actually almost a decrease in fault level compared to the distance of cables that we have covered. So for the industry, we have better protections, we have more awareness, we have newer cables that are potentially subject to less faults, and therefore there is a really good level of resilience. But that practical measure, that day-to-day conversation, isn't always being held in the same rooms as the people who are talking about the military threats. So to kind of close with a reference back to the report, I really loved that consistent throughout, there is a real emphasis on how do we put together practical steps and how do we work collaboratively to tackle these? Because as you say, there are different perspectives, all of which have value, and bringing those together is where we'll really find our strength. So that's me.
That's great. Thanks so much, Rebecca. That really sets out many of the key questions, and is very reassuring too. So thank you very much for those words. We're going to hold questions till the end. So we'll ask Ben to speak next, and then followed by Garrett. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you, Ola. Thank you, and good morning to everyone. And firstly, congratulations to the IIEA for a really valuable report, very timely and very well put together. And also thank you, Sabrina team, for giving me the opportunity to be here today. One of my favorite cities, if not my favorite city, outside of London.
You get extra brownie points for that, Ben.
Exactly, it is fantastic. It's rare that it's nice and sunny and just the perfect temperature here. No, as actually Sabrina said earlier, we're talking about Vodafone Ireland now being 25 years young, I like to think. And in those 25 years, really we have changed as a company here in Ireland, but as a group, almost beyond recognition. We started off as a mobile phone company, as Sabrina said, connecting people with phones that gradually got smaller and smaller, eventually got slightly bigger again, but from something which was a small part of our lives to now something which is an absolutely fundamental part of our lives. And how we position ourselves as Vodafone is also changing over time. And in fact, some of our most recent positioning, which hopefully you'll all see more of going forward, we talk about from the seabed to the stars. And that is, in fact, who we are now as a company. We're no longer a land-based mobile phone network company. We are operating on the sea or on the seabed. We're operating on the ground. And increasingly, we have ambitions to operate not quite at the stars, but somewhere towards the stars. And that is because we've become such a fundamental part of the economies, the societies within which we operate in. And with that comes obviously more responsibility. And I would just want to touch on some of the themes that have been referred to already today, with one which, Rebecca, you almost referred to, but I'll expand on it. We talked a lot about security. We talked about a lot about resilience. Of course, this is fundamentally important. The other side of this is also competitiveness, and we cannot lose sight of the fact that one of the reasons we want to be secure and resilient is because we want Ireland, and we want the whole of Europe indeed, to be competitive in what is increasingly a global economy and a global economic race. And therefore, as our infrastructure, as our connectivity, as our services become more entrenched in each and every one of ours everyday life, our businesses, their everyday life, our governments, their everyday life. So the need to be secure, the need to be resilient, and the need also to have that within the context of competitiveness becomes ever more evident and obvious. And we see some of the numbers that are estimated in terms of the economic loss when networks go down, and they're not always within our control. Our networks rely on energy networks. We have storms, we have man-made disasters, but that when these networks do go down, the cost runs in the billions. And it's a cost which economies do not want to and shouldn't have to absorb. But there's an additional dimension which I think has been almost missing from this morning, but let me just bring it in now. And then I was struck with the question of, why is this so difficult? We talk about security and resilience, and of course there's complexities around where does the role lie with the private enterprise, where does the role lie with the state? But what really makes it such a difficult question within our sector is because of the dynamic nature of our sector. You did use the word dynamism earlier, and I want to expand on that. And what one can talk about security and resilience measures for static sectors. The energy sector is relatively static. The water sector is relatively static. They're not fully, but they are, still utilities. And one can talk about the need for physical security, for cybersecurity of their systems, but they're not fundamentally changing every single day. The connectivity sector is fundamentally changing every day. And the difficulty is trying to build security and resilience measures today that will also work in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, where we know we're going to be fundamentally different again. And the services we provide and the systems that we support will not be recognizable from where we are today. We talk about satellite. There's a whole new world of security and resilience of satellite systems, which we're only just scratching the surface of when it comes to integrating into everyday connectivity. So we really have a challenge to work out, how do we make sure that we take the sector forward? And this comes to all of you talked about the amount of time I spend in Brussels. We have so much European legislation at the moment, which is overlapping, should be working in tandem, but sometimes works in different directions. And without, in my view, a sufficiently overarching vision of where does the sector need to get to today, tomorrow, 5 years, 10 years' time, and making sure that within the context of an extremely dynamic sector, can we ensure that we have the right level of security measures, resilience measures, also allow operators like us, because we are the driving force of innovation, to innovate, to invest, to build the new networks, to build the new systems, which make sure that competitiveness is not viewed through a static lens, but through a dynamic lens, but one which is done in true harmony with security and resilience, where we ensure that the costs are, well distributed. We have to ensure that where state has true capacity and capability, they need to lean in. And there are certain things that we as private enterprises simply cannot do. There is, physical security is an obvious example. We can protect our sites to a certain extent, but when they become truly critical, then we need the state to lean in as well. But making sure that all of the legislation, all of the regulation, which is highly present and something which I deal with literally every single day, is not just about how do we make sure we are secure and resilient today, but how do we make sure the sector as a whole in Europe can go forward, invest in confidence, and make sure that we have the networks of tomorrow with the same security and resilience which we will need to make sure that our economies and our societies have connectivity, the best, the world class, which is critical for global competitiveness, but also that they're secure and resilient, and so they shouldn't fail. And for me, we're having that conversation now, and I think that's why this report is so good, because so much. It's not a question of, do we need security and resilience? That question has long gone. That ship has long sailed. The question being answered is, how do we ensure that we have the right approach? How do we ensure that the responsibilities are equitably shared? And how do we make sure that we're taking European connectivity forward in a way which is fit for the true digital age, which we are well and truly in now?
Thank you, Ben. You're really setting out big challenges for us indeed. Thank you. Garrett, you'll answer some of those, I've no doubt.
Well, let's see. Let's try. And I just want to say first, it's a great report, and it's very helpful. I suppose as we take on new functions, particularly around resilience, it's very helpful to have a report like this that has good engagement across sort of many parts of society as part of it. There was probably three things that we wanted to just raise in respect of the report, and if the first one relates to what you were saying, Ben, is what's the cost to society? We had done a report on this, the cost of a network incident for society. This was back in 2023. So I was rereading our report in the context of today's discussion. And actually, it's quite interesting. I think it was very clear there's a significant and growing cost. The pandemic was probably a sort of a game changer. We suddenly realized it's not loss of connectivity, it's the glue that makes the digital infrastructure work. It's become something that's not just loss of entertainment, that it might have been in the past, to something that's loss of livelihood. It's absolutely essential to, and customers' tolerance of loss of connectivity is dropping all the time. They expect it to be there all the time for good reason. So the cost is there. I think what we probably underestimated in that report looking back in 23 is the threat landscape. I think we talked about, AI is AI use by operators, and maybe it doesn't quite work the way you expected. I'm not sure we fully anticipated AI use by threat actors. I mean, the discussion yesterday, people reading in the paper about the OpenAI's agentic broke out of its sandbox and went out onto the internet and attacked someone, and you're just going, gosh, this is like science fiction stuff. So we really are seeing and this AI component is a massive change. I'd argue it's quite a change for the energy sector and water sector as well. So it is having an impact and will have massive impact for connectivity. But we need to look at that sort of, and keep coming back to the cost to society. The cost to society is probably higher than the cost to the companies. So we'll need to make sure that we can, that there are the standards there that meet society's needs, not just the commercial needs for the company. I think that's part of the challenge of making sure we act on resilience. Just in terms of the report, there's a sort of that section around spectrum. We're probably not going to see IIEA on the spectrum side, and we're reflecting a position here that, the regulators across Europe, this is BEREC, the telecom regulators, also RSPG, we've been very clear. We think the current mechanism, it's a scarce resource, spectrum, and it needs to be efficiently allocated. And we think the efficient allocation of that and done in a way that meets society's needs. And in fact, we need to reset that every so often, but reflecting that it needs to have a long time frame to meet your investment needs, but arguably investment needs 10, 15, 20 years should cover equipment, goes through a much faster cycle, which is back to your point about the constant change in the telecom sector. So we'll probably agree to disagree on what needs to happen on spectrum. We're quite happy with the current arrangements. We think that they're delivering. And the third one then is really just around, I think in the report it talks about returns, and I think there was a reference to a good return. And I think that was probably my fault. I might have said that, and I'll go back and sort of correct myself. I think we don't, as a regulator, want you to get a good return. It's a reasonable return. And a reasonable return, I think, is but good sign could be a bit too good. And I think there will be an imbalance. I'm sure you don't think you've got too good returns at the moment, but let's make sure efficient return is where we try and get to the sort of the optimal perfect. So that's probably enough of initial thoughts from me.
That's great. Thanks, Garrett. Ben, you were itching to get in there. I could see you. Go for it.
I want to respond on the spectrum point because I do feel there's important nuance here. Maybe we do see more eye to eye than actually is suggested by what is currently quite a public debate. But in fact, we had a meeting last week. It's not secret as such, with the MEP Kobosco, who's the lead rapporteur in the European Parliament on this file. And we had a very constructive conversation with him. I'm on the record here, so I won't go into all the details.
Yeah.
But on the spectrum point, which was an area of discussion, he made the point that he's unsure about this terminology about indefinite licenses, which is something that the European Commission has proposed in the Digital Networks Act. And does it give effectively too much power back to the operators? And as you say, this is something that should be under the control of regulators. And our response, and I think this is really important nuance to bring to this debate, is we actually don't feel like the proposal to have indefinite spectrum licenses is giving us more control. On the contrary, we think it's giving control back to regulators for the simple reason that, as of today, we take, say, a 20-year license in you know, in some of our best cases, sometimes 15, but let's say 20. To a large extent, the regulator then sits back and says, okay, towards the end of that 20-year license, let me assess what's going on, and I will determine if we need to make change or otherwise. What the European Commission has actually proposed is a far more stringent regime whereby at every single point in time, the regulator is given the power to assess the market, to determine whether the operators in the market are behaving themselves, and if they're not, can start a process to take the spectrum away. So to some extent, we have less control, not more control. So why are we so happy about the proposal? Is because we have to back ourselves to behave ourselves. Now, and we do back ourselves, and if we are behaving, we actually get the spectrum for as long as we are behaving, and that gives us far greater confidence to invest. And we don't get into the Mexican standoff where 5 years before a license is to be renewed, we don't know what the conditions will be. I was in Paris yesterday talking to the single market Sherpa for the French government and saying, it is absurd that after years of spectrum licenses, I can look across our European footprint. I can look at all of our spectrum, which expires between now and 2035. I haven't got a clue what mechanism we use to renew any of those spectrum licenses. It could be entirely different in every single one of the member states within which we operate. And that's not the regime which we want to give us the certainty to invest. But we're happy to trade off control. We'll give you control. You can do a market review every single year and tell us whether we're behaving ourselves. And part of this discussion today, the behaving ourselves is about, are we sufficiently secure? Are we sufficiently resilient? Are we driving investment and competitiveness forward? And that's a grown-up conversation to have after, say, what now feels like a 25-year marriage. We're at the point where we're not talking about divorce. You know, it's great. We were here for the long term, but we need to have that grown-up conversation. Okay, let's assess every year what we're doing. Are we doing things in the right way? And we're confident we'll back ourselves that we will do things in the right way, because we always work hand in glove with governments on security, on resilience, and indeed on economic competitiveness. And that way we get a far more certain landscape for us to invest with confidence and to give economies and societies what they need.
Okay, that's an ask, Ben. I'm sure Garrett will bank that one.
I mean, I think, if you don't mind me just coming back quickly, look, this is about evidence. All good regulation is about evidence, and good policy making is about evidence. I'm not sure we've seen any evidence to back all these sort of ideas, and I'm not sure I even understand the concept that we would constantly make or change our mind and you'd be happy with that. I don't see how that provides regulatory certainty, but let's maybe park it, because we could end up, you know, resilience is a much broader discussion.
Clearly, for future discussion, and always when we have these events, we leave with topics and subjects and questions, and that's obviously a really good sign of continuing engagement and continuing stakeholder engagement. I have questions to ask, but I'm also conscious of time, and people have been very patiently listening. So before I ask anything, I'm going to just see who in the audience would like to ask a question. I have one person here. I have over here, a lady over here, and I have here. I'm going to start over here at this side of the room, if I may. And if you would perhaps introduce yourself, and if you have an affiliation, you might let us know. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Orla. My name's Aoife Langford. I'm from the Central Bank of Ireland. And firstly, I do want to say thank you for the report, the event, and all the experts today. The financial sector is one of the sectors that relies heavily on a robust and resilient digital infrastructure, as does all of the economy and services, and this is only increasing. So this is a really interesting conversation for us. I suppose I've heard common themes today of building increased resilience is a priority. Everyone's agreed on that. There's a wide range of stakeholders involved, and they all need to work together. But resilience and increasing resilience is not cost-free. So I suppose the question that comes to my mind is, given the different stakeholders and different perspectives, do we have a common understanding about what we mean by an appropriate or adequate level of resilience? And maybe the panel stakeholders could tell us what their view on that is. And if we don't, how do we come to a common understanding? Because there's always going to be tensions. And how do we agree who does what and who bears costs? So a nice, easy question to start you off.
Thanks very much for that, Aoife. And maybe Rebecca, can I turn to you for that one first?
It's a great question, and it's a really, really important question. And I suspect it's a question that will never fully, truly be answered. So in terms of defining it, I think we can get to a place that is good. I don't think we can ever get to perfection. And I believe it's recommendation 6, Cian, you'll know for sure. But if we look at options around dialogue, specifically looking at things like crisis resilience and crisis planning, and about building those peer-to-peer relationships, about building those established mechanisms, so you do know who to pick up the phone to and you have a relationship with them, and you're not, when you're in a critical resilience juncture where suddenly things have gone wrong, you're not trying to build from scratch the team to deal with it. So I think it's about keeping those common conversations going, so that while everyone in the room may have a slightly different perspective on resilience, you can agree collectively what the action is and what the best way forward is. And that at least gives you you can certainly have an agree to disagree perspective, as long as you're consistent on the actions that you will be taking collectively. Which also, you've mentioned costs, and I think that's a really good way to also help manage that incredibly difficult linked but separate conversation of, if something's resilient, who pays for it. And I think sort of the big handful themes of, actually, if government thinks that something is critical national infrastructure, if it wants to harden a particular bit of that infrastructure as being nationally critical, then there is definitely strong conversations to be had about government support to that hardening, to that support to that resilience, and what that looks like. But the conversations need to be had in the first place. So I think this next sort of step is to make sure that those really difficult, sometimes contentious, never comfortable conversations, people get around a table, talk together, and work out a common way.
Okay, thanks for that, Rebecca. Garrett or Ben, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I might come in. So I think it raises, I mean, this idea of what is resilience? How do you get to that standard? I think we need to be sort of, there's a lot of discussion about compliance. We take like sort of cybersecurity. There's lots of standards out there for cybersecurity. I think compliance is necessary, but not sufficient. I think we have to reflect a very dynamic threat landscape. So I think probably the word assurance might be better. What we need to do is we need companies understand their risks better. Now, there may be some element of commonality, sort of cross-sectoral risks that we should look at as well. But companies need to be able to look from a risk perspective, analyze those risks, and make sure that they've captured those risks to a reasonable level. And there's always, you'll never get 100% resilience. So you need to get to that reasonable level. There's a discussion about what that level is, but we, as a regulator, need to make sure that somebody is not sort of getting competitive advantage in the market by running fast and loose on resilience and saying, sure, we'll avoid those costs, and sure, we don't care about the consequences. That will be a bad outcome. So we need to protect against that. In terms of the cost, I mean, I think that there's this genuine question about where the costs get recovered. What should the state do versus, what should the sector do? We're into sort of economic theory here, but in theory, if there's a common sort of obligation across the sector, then that can't be competed away. That's not something that there's sort of that's subject to competition. So it should, in due course, then flow through into the prices seen by consumers. There's a massive cost to consumers of not having resilience, and it's unfair for the consumer to try and make some sort of competition decision on the basis of, I think, company A is more resilient than company B. That's too complicated for a consumer to try and do. So that's where regulation is saying you can guarantee that resilience is there, but the cost of that resilience then flows through to the consumer. And only if there's a failure in the market, and sort of the National Broadband Plan, the Secretary General talked about, that as a success. Though clearly there was a failure. There was a lot of work done to demonstrate the fact that it was a failure, not just nationally, but actually to convince state aid processes at a European level, this is definitely a failure in the market. That was accepted, and it was a good intervention. But I think the state needs to be very careful, that it's not seen as a sort of a soft touch in this process, because it'll distort markets and distort incentives. The market, let the market work. The market will also drive innovation in this process. Innovation and resilience will be good just as much as is in everything else.
Thanks, Garrett.
Yeah, let's just build some complex themes. I mean, the one thing on if there's a level playing field and everyone has to incur the same costs, in theory, yes, it should then all be passed through to consumers in the same way. The only thing I'd caution on that point is, because of the nature of our industry as an industry with very high fixed costs, to the extent these costs are fixed and sunk, where some of the resilience costs are fixed and sunk, we've got repeated evidence of the industry not being able to recover those fixed and sunk costs because of the highly competitive nature of the retail market. And that's just something we need to be mindful of in terms of, where state intervenes through market failure. That could be another example of market failure, where either we don't have the ability to pass those costs on a repeated basis, and either you then cut corners elsewhere because you have to earn a fair and reasonable return on capital, but that can slow the innovation cycle and the investment cycle elsewhere. So it is one we just need to be very careful about. The other thing on the resilience side, which I find interesting, is when we had the start of the Russian invasion into Ukraine and the energy crisis through the EU, there was a lot of focus on how to prioritize energy in the event there would be a shortage of supply. And I careful I wish for, but it's almost we need the same in reverse on telecoms. We need to then think about what are the critical applications that need to be prioritized in the event there would be an attack. We can try and be as resilient as possible, but as Rebecca said, you're never going to get 100% security. So also we need to have a grown-up conversation about how to prioritize, and it sort of runs contrary to the mindset of part of the regulation around open internet, where everything has to be treated equally. Actually, in the modern network, we shouldn't be treating everything equally. We should be treating mission critical applications, banking applications, also where we provide security through drone applications. These all need to have a system of prioritization, which ensures that we're ready in the hopefully unlikely event that we have a crisis of supply.
Okay, thank you, Ben. We had two questions over here, so I might take the two together if that's okay, gentleman at the back, and then gentleman here in the front row.
I'm a member of the IIEA. I just want to ask, want to make a point about the call for more civil servants in this report. I just don't believe it. At various stages in the development of this state, wasn't more civil servants were brought in. For example, 100 years ago when the ESB was being set up, the then Minister Patrick Gilligan decided that civil servants were not the appropriate forum. Similarly, some years ago when the Post and Telegraphs department were making a mess of providing telecoms, it had to be taken out of the state. Key characteristic of civil servants is, and I mean civil servants, is that the minister must never be embarrassed. And the truth of the matter is that they are not good at market design. They always like to interfere in the market, and they don't ever try to create a new market or design. And
Can I check, have you a question on this?
The question is this a serious proposal given our history of civil servants having to be, I'll use the word, overridden by the political system? Even Lamass did it.
Okay.
He called for development corporations. And the market design question is important, if you don't mind my saying so. The renewable energy industry here emerged from the liberalization of the EU electricity market when the
sorry, I want to get people in, and we're under a little bit of time pressure, so can I take that question as read?
Okay.
Thank you so much. Gentleman here at the front.
Stephen Breen, TNS Europe. The conversation today is very much about our critical national infrastructure across Ireland, Europe, and globally, and the investments and the collaboration, how we protect and monitor. My question is, whilst many of these decisions are taken at national and European level, many of the actors with whom we have to pay a close eye, we've referenced Russia, China, for example, their political systems are dynasties, whereas in our democracies, we work in 4-year cycles. And Ben used the term from the seabed to the stars, lovely way to look at it. I wonder, do any of you as a panel have a view in terms of how we make sure that these commitments and decisions and investments go beyond 4-year cycles to make sure that they aren't interrupted, adjusted unnecessarily, because these are essentially seismic shifts that we really have to get right over decades as opposed to over electoral cycles, if you have a view on that, please.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. Right, two somewhat related questions, but not quite. Well, I start with you, Garrett. I'll come the opposite way this time.
So I'll try and answer to that. I mean, and you might be better, Orla, than I am in arguing the question with the civil servants. I think numbers actually is probably not a great way of, what we need is very clever people with lots of experience that are involved, certainly in terms of, you know, and I'm not a civil servant, I'm a sort of a public servant, and I'm working for an agency. And I think the allocation, you know, spectrum was done by the department, it's now done by us as an agency. Agencies tend to have more expertise. We've a lot of industry people. It's a great place to work. So if anyone's looking for a good job, you know, sorry for the pitch, but it's the quality of the people. It's not just the number of the people. You know, in fact, with technology and the use of, you know, AI and all these other things, what we need is really clever people, not just a large volume of people. That doesn't work for me. I think coming back to that sort of broader question about the 4-year cycle, I think, again, I'm making a pitch for the value of agencies. We as a regulator, we're independent from government. You know, we're not, I've seen many different ministers over my period as a regulator, and they'll all have slightly different views. Sometimes they try and get you to do something that's good for a constituency, and you go, sorry, no, Minister, that's not possible. You know, we're here to do a job. And so we are landscape, and I think it's important that you have regulation that thinks about the long time scale. And we've had this argument about spectrum, but we look at spectrum over a 20-year cycle. We're not saying what spectrum is needed in 1 year or 2 year. You need to have confidence. Society needs to make investments in a much longer time frame. So I do think agencies and the structure of independent agencies supports that.
Okay, thank you, Garrett.
I'll certainly echo that. I mean, and it sort of links the two questions. The fact that we do have a civil service, which sits outside of the political cycle, gives us a consistency that helps us, for us with an industry. We plan 10, 20 years into the future. It gives us that consistency. And I look in the UK, we worked under, in recent memory, a Boris Johnson government, a Rishi Sunak government. You know, we've got a Keir Starmer government. Now we've got DSIC going into DBIS, going into DCMS. So even the civil service is a little bit in flux. But yet the people we talk to stay relatively constant. Of course, there's changes over time. And because of the nature of our sector, I don't feel that we have a massive change in conversation from one administration to the other. Same is true in the European Commission. You know, we have the change of, you know, we've got von der Leyen from taking over from say the Juncker regime, different political personalities. But underneath it at DG Connect, you have a lot of the workhorses are the same people with the same drive and the same vision around how our sector as critical national infrastructure needs to embed into all other sectors in the economy, and that those conversations don't change drastically with the political cycle. But the only other thing to say, which I think is referenced in the report, is just to highlight it again, in terms of the difference between short-term political cycles we have in Europe and the West versus longer-term non-cycle, shall we say Russia and China, North Korea, and how that plays into the threat landscape. That's why I think one of the recommendations on the report, where private sector and public sector have to come together, share the different bits of information they have. You know, it has to be that 1 + 1 makes 4 in this case, because otherwise we fragment ourselves and we can't meet the level of threat that we will be facing.
Great, thank you. Rebecca.
Ben, I think you said beautifully exactly the point that I was going to emphasize on the nature of sort of having apolitical civil servants is a real asset. And so returning the compliment, I thought I might speak slightly on the commercial aspect. So to the question on sort of market dynamics and the civil service involvement in that, I think you don't want your civil service to be involved in market dynamics because you don't want them to have a commercial or competitive mindset, because that brings you into conversations around advantage and, you know, potential benefits for one organization over another. And you want that level of political neutrality, you want that impartiality, you want that level of distance. You obviously need a level of understanding. You need to be able to engage. You need to be able to have a conversation and to understand what drives the sector and how sort of specific dynamics and targets and progression and innovation is shaped. That's really important, but you don't need to be involved in those processes in order to support the environment that helps those flourish. So I'd say sort of the neutrality point, I think, is a really critical one. I won't comment specifically on numbers, but I think it generally needs to be adaptable to the dynamics in the environment that we see, and that will be set sort of by each government and each organisation. So I will leave that one there.
Okay, and maybe just I'll add to that, because I can't resist, as a Secretary General for 7 years, and I worked with 5 government ministers and 10 junior ministers during that 7-year term. I would agree with Garrett in terms of the policy direction didn't change overly, sometimes absolutely change of emphasis. But we had within the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment, we had 14 offices and agencies. And actually what the civil service can do and can do very well is coordination. And quite often you will find, and particularly in Ireland, which is a small country, some people will argue are over-agentified. And so I think there's a role between the private sector, the civil service, and indeed the agencies to try and best manage. And there is no doubt we are living in a far more complex world than we did 10 years, 20 years ago. And our population has almost doubled in the last 25 years. So I can certainly see the point, what you're making. I could certainly agree with aspects of it, but I don't particularly agree with your point about civil servants saying what the minister wants, because certainly I have never worked with a minister that I didn't give advice that was absolutely 100% independent and correct. And that was based on advice, working with stakeholders such as are in this room, and getting the benefit of all views. And that is the benefit of pulling together the different advisors. So that's, I suppose, my tuppence halfpenny worth on that question. We're coming to a close, but I'm just conscious, is there any burning questions left in the room? We have one person here. And let me just ask you to, again, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
Thank you so much, Orla, and thanks to the panel, and especially thanks to the speakers. Very interesting paper today, and I think a lot of great reading for us. So I'm Owen Kalina from Atlantic Technological University. I'm the head of research. And my question is kind of a simple one based on where we are at the minute. For the university sector at the moment, there's massive interest in us in defence and intelligence and technical networks funding, particularly when the last 12 months, this has significantly ramped up. So our national universities are now in a position that we're responding. We already do work in underwater acoustics and space technologies, scale composites, and different universities, research institutes and research centres are involved in looking at the problem space. So can I have the panel's views on the role of the universities, our research centres and institutes in being the bridge between enterprise and also government in terms of how we're going to move forward in providing that resilience?
Great question. Any final one before I go back to our panel? We have a lady over here on the right, and you are going to be our final question of the day. Thank you so much.
Hi there. It's Nicola Cook here, Director of Telecommunications Industry Ireland at IBEC. Just want to say thanks for a fantastic discussion, brilliant paper. And I suppose as the organisation that represents most of the industry, I think this has come up a lot of times today. There is that gap there between the industry getting its point across or engaging. I think Feargal said it, a lot of people have said it. Look, we're very willing to engage. If you just take something out there, there's obviously the national context and then there's European context. Like the Cybersecurity Act is going to affect, Cybersecurity Act 2 is going to affect 18 sectors. We came up with that figure of a rip and replace costing 730 million. Now, forget about investing in 5G and 6G if you have to pull all your equipment out of the ground. There wasn't a proper impact assessment done around that. It's going to affect everything from inverters and solar panels to sensors in the pharma sector. So again, there's all this kind of regulation and there's a resilience, but what about innovation and competitiveness? Looking at the US, looking at Asia. And I do think that the big piece missing here is that kind of stakeholder where everybody's voice is at the table. And I do think there needs to be a bit more engagement on that front. And that's something that we would look to as TII engage with. And I know most of you sitting up there. So just to say that kind of the big takeaway from today, I think, is that point. And I think there's some brilliant recommendations in the report. And I suppose just to ask the panel, do they think that wider piece that Ben spoke about, that vision, is the thing that can bring us all together and bring us to that place?
Okay. Two final questions to finish up with. Rebecca, do you want to start? Or no, I'll start with yourself, Ben. You haven't started yet. I'll give you the floor first.
You are very democratic. Thank you very much. So in bad form, I'll take the first question second and the second question first. But so thank you. On the Cybersecurity Act, so a couple of points I just want to raise. So firstly, Cian, on your slide, you put the numbers of the impact assessment of the European Commission. Actually, helpfully, just yesterday, the GSMA, our industry association, published a research report which had actually used operator data to estimate the cost, as opposed to what we believe were very high-level estimates, which were provided by the Commission's consultant. And that shows that the actual cost will sit between 30 to 40 billion euros for the telecom sector. So orders of magnitude greater than the Commission had first estimated. And we think that's a really important piece of evidence to bring into the debate, which will rage in the months ahead on how to take the CSA2 forward. But it does link certainly to what I said earlier, which is we want policy to be joined up and to take the industry as a whole forward in a correct and appropriate manner. And for us as a private sector company, it is not up for us to decide what the ultimate landing zone should be for Europe, and European institutions have to decide what the relationship with China will be, whether that's on equipment and whether it's on trade more broadly. That is something that we have to take as a decision, a political decision, which we have to respect. But what we are asking for is that when policy decisions are made, they are deliverable and feasible. And the issue we have with the Cybersecurity Act is that we'll be asked to remove all high-risk vendors from our networks within a 3-year period. These are live networks which cannot go down. They cannot fail. And that's been the whole nature of the discussion today. So having a policy on the one hand which tells you to absorb a huge amount of cost in a time period which has never been done before and is not really feasible, that flies in the face of what long-term security and resilience and joined-up policy making should be. So we're in favour of having a very clear landing zone, which the European institutions need to decide what that is, but the decision needs to be risk-based, proportionate, and actually deliverable. And then going just to the first question on collaboration with universities. So it's a more complicated question than I can cover, but in a small way, I can have a small contribution, which is we're actually doing a collaboration right now with the University of Bonn. And we have, based out of Berlin, we have something called the Vodafone Institute. It's our sort of in-house think tank. And we asked the University of Bonn to do research for us on a variety of topics relating to digital dependence. And they've just published the second policy brief this week, which looked at the issue of IP and licensing. And what we see is a frightening trend of the European role in IP and licensing on technology, connectivity standards and patents dropping massively. Obviously, China's taking over. And for us, this what they highlight is two things. Number one is we're not spending enough time at the research level in innovating, but also where we don't license, we don't patent, and even when we do patent, we don't make it commercially viable. So we have to have a much more forward-looking and really, given the risks we see in the world, a much more joined up way of working with universities and with governments to say, are we innovating? Are we actually licensing what we innovate and using that as a means of being more financially secure and being just more in control of our digital destiny? So I'd encourage people to look it up on the University of Bonn. Very interesting research on IP and licensing, but it goes to the heart of how we need to work together more with industry and research to put Europe into a stronger place on connectivity and on innovation.
Okay. Thank you. Garrett.
So I might start with the value of having really good institutions working on really important stuff. And I suppose we feel a lot of commonality with institutions. You're evidence-based, you're independent in your decisions. That's something that feels very comfortable for us, engaging with institutions. I think the focus on what's important, that's a tough decision. And I think that's, again, that, the relevance, making sure that it's relevant, making sure that it's genuinely benefiting society. I'm on a board in Europe of SER, which is a regulatory think tank, and it's an institution that has a multi-sectoral, so it's not just the telecom sector and digital infrastructure. It covers quite a few sectors, but we have a really good mix of academics and regulators and industry, and that sort of mix of getting those three groups working together get some really fantastic results. So, it's also a great source of talent as well. So if you're looking for good staff, it's always a good thing. But sort of coming back down to the question, and I do think you picked on something there that is really relevant, which is back to, we're saying, what are the standards for resilience? We need to be risk-based. We need to go back to what's the underlying risk. Let's be careful about not imposing unnecessary costs. Now, that's a policy matter. So we're just sort of, in a sense, a sort of an observer. As we may be involved in some elements of delivery of that policy once it's put in legislation. So getting if you want good regulation, you need to start with good legislation. So, it's really important to get that legislative piece right. I think it's important debate, and I sort of, do have a lot of sympathy with the idea that it's risk-based. Let's be clear about what the underlying risks are. We've heard certainly people say, oh, this sounds more like policy dressed up as security. I don't know whether there's validity in that or not, but I think it's an important, it's an important debate. But in a sense, whatever the legislation is, if we have a role in implementing it, we'll implement it. So, at this point, it's an important debate to continue to have.
Thank you, Garrett. Rebecca.
So I will also take the questions in left to right order for me. And I very much support what both of my fellow panelists have said. I think it's a really critical relationship, and it's a critical enabler for the sector and the sector's future in ways that we don't yet understand, that because the research is still ongoing or it hasn't happened yet. But to sort of look slightly retrospectively, so some of the work that I do in support to SubOptic UK Foundation as a trustee is work on the education side. And I was recently on a panel with Dame Paulina Bavel of UCL, and researching her work. I'm not a scientist, I'm not a sort of a technical specialist, but seeing the pattern of her research and how it has essentially enabled the fibre optic networks that we know today, along with the work of her colleagues and peers, is a really incredible insight into how a very small collective of people can have incredible impact based on the research that they do. So I'd just sort of reinforce what my fellow panelists have said of it is vital for future innovation, for future technology in ways we don't yet understand, which is why it needs to continue to be supported, because the sector of the future is in the hands of people who are doing research in this sort of space. So very much supportive of that. And then to the final question, I believe it was Nicola, it's a really, really complicated problem. And I very much hear in what you said, I think this happens across a lot of government technology interfaces. I previously worked on cyber resilience for defence organisations for the UK. And it was exactly those conversations of immense amounts of regulation, very complex problems, very high costs, very high requirements. And it just was, it was a huge set of tasks to be tackled and no clear pathway through. And it took probably a good decade to unpick some of that complexity and some of those problems. And it was done through conversation and through sharing what the risks are. I wrote a comment earlier, which I think is very, very timely here, that no single entity has a clear view of risk, including their own. No single company, however insightful it is, however good its analysis is, it operates in a complex world and changing environments and changing threats. And it's not possible for any of us to have a clear view of our own risk profile. So working together is essential to help tackle it. And governments sometimes are a very blunt instrument in terms of they're trying to address a complex problem, details of which may not necessarily be shareable. So again, it comes back to the point of the report of the more we can have dialogue, particularly in secure spaces and with the necessary clearances on really high-end and complicated threats, the better outcomes we're going to have. But it does involve being able to have those conversations, being able to collaborate, and being able to feel comfortable enough to share those risks and threats, which particularly when they're commercially sensitive can be very uncomfortable. And it comes back again to building those peer-to-peer relationships and creating space for discussion. So a complicated problem with no clear answer, I'm afraid, but I very much empathise with where you're coming from.
Thank you, Rebecca. And normally at events like this, we usually have quite a number of online questions, and interesting for this particular occasion, we've actually one has just come in, and I'm not going to put it to the panel, but it really relates to your final comments because it's from Cian FitzGerald, who's from the NESC, and he asks, given the complexity and need for coherence, should we have a National Security and Resilience Authority to develop a strategy? So it kind of, in some ways, Cian, we won't answer it for you, but I think you've certainly heard from all the discussion. Everybody has talked about the importance of dialogue, partnership, and then how best we can do that will be the subject of another discussion and many discussions, I have no doubt. So we have gone slightly over. Thank you for your patience. I think it has certainly been well worth the discussion. Just to sum up, can I thank our contributors, Feargal from earlier, Rebecca, Garrett and Ben. Your expertise, your contribution has been wonderful. Can I thank particularly our our senior researcher, Cian, and Barry, our head of research, for the report. Can I thank all of you for your contributions? Can I thank Vodafone and Sabrina and wish you success on your 25th anniversary and for hosting us and partnering with us. This is what the Institute does. It prepares really good research, it partners, it engages, it leads discussions, and it connects. As an independent agency, we do depend on members and member subscriptions. So any of you in the room that are not already members, either at a corporate level or an individual, I would really encourage you to join us and be part of these discussions for the future. Any of the team here you could talk to afterwards. This conversation will continue, I have no doubt. It is extremely important to our country, to Europe and globally. Can I wish everybody involved in this sector every success and every good wish, because you have very, very responsible jobs in taking that discussion forward. Thank you for your participation today, and I close.
This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.